Imagine two teenagers in love. A 16-year-old girl with short blonde hair, described by everyone who knew her as bubbly, witty, and beautiful. An 18-year-old airman from Texas, stationed far from home, who had found in this quiet Montana city the one person he wanted to spend his life with. They had spent Christmas together with her family. They were already talking about marriage. And on the evening of January 2nd, 1956, they drove to a spot along the Sun River that teenagers in Great Falls, Montana knew simply as the Lover's Lane, a quiet stretch of road west of the city where young people went when they wanted to be alone. They were last seen leaving Pete's drive-in restaurant together at 9 p.m. When they didn't come home that night, their families assumed they had eloped. They had not eloped. The next morning, three boys out hiking along the Sun River found the boy face down beside his car. His hands were tied behind his back with his own belt. He had been shot twice in the head. The car engine was still running. The headlights were still on. His expensive camera was untouched on the seat. The girl was nowhere to be found. The day after that, a county road worker found her body at the bottom of a 20-foot embankment on a gravel road north of Great Falls. She had been raped and shot in the head. She was still 16 years old. Her name was Patricia Kalitsky. His name was Lloyd Dwayne Bogle. And what happened to them on the night of January 2nd, 1956 in Great Falls, Montana would remain unanswered for 65 years, making it what investigators believe is the oldest cold case in the United States ever solved through genetic genealogy. This is not a story about a criminal who left behind obvious clues or a case solved within a few weeks. This is the story of a killer who quietly packed up his family and left Great Falls just 6 weeks after the murders, lived freely for the rest of his life in another state, and died in 2007 never having been questioned, never having been suspected, carrying the secret of that January night to his grave. And yet, for reasons we will explore, the case was never forgotten, never closed, and never abandoned, thanks to the persistence of investigators across multiple generations who knew that somewhere in the evidence archives, a single microscope slide was holding the answer. They just needed the right technology to read it. But let's go back to the beginning. In January 1956, America was living through the quiet confidence of the post-war years. The Korean War had ended 3 years before. Dwight Eisenhower was in the White House. In living rooms across the country, families were gathering around their first television sets. And on the radio, a young man from Mississippi named Elvis Presley was beginning to make the kind of noise that would soon change everything. America felt stable. America felt safe. And in Great Falls, Montana, a city of 40,000 people spread across the wide plains of Cascade County at the foot of the Rocky Mountains, life moved at the rhythm of small western cities where people worked at the military base and the local farms, where neighbors knew each other by name, and where teenagers drove to Pete's drive-in on Friday nights and felt no reason to worry about anything. Patricia Kalitsky, known to her friends simply as Ski, was 16 years old, a junior at Great Falls High School. She had recently cut her hair short in a style she loved. She was tall, blonde, and full of the kind of energy that made rooms brighter when she walked in. Her classmates remembered her as bubbly, witty, and beautiful. She had grown up on these streets. She had a family at home, school in the morning, and a future that was entirely ahead of her. Lloyd Dwayne Bogle was 18, a young airman from Waco, Texas, assigned to the 29th Fighter Interceptor Squadron at Malmstrom Air Force Base just outside Great Falls. He had traveled a long way from the flat plains of central Texas to the wide, open skies of Montana. And in this unfamiliar city, he had found Patricia Kalitsky, and he had been, as Detective Sergeant John Cadner would describe it 65 years later, instantly smitten with Patty. Lloyd had spent Christmas with her family. He had stayed through the New Year celebrations. He carried an expensive camera because he was the kind of young man who wanted to capture the life he was beginning to build. The two of them were already talking about marriage. Patricia's parents liked him. The future felt close and real and full of possibility. On the evening of January 2nd, 1956, the two of them went out together. They were seen at Pete's drive-in restaurant on Central Avenue just after 9 p.m., the popular teenage gathering spot in Great Falls where young people had burgers and milkshakes and laughed and made plans. Witnesses saw them there. Then they drove west out of the city along Central Avenue toward the Sun River, toward the stretch of road near Wadsworth Park that teenagers in Great Falls quietly knew as the Lover's Lane, a place where couples parked and talked and felt invisible to the rest of the world. Patricia's parents expected her home at a decent hour. She had school in the morning. When she did not come home that night, and when Lloyd did not return to the base, their family spent a few hours in the particular anxiety of parents waiting for teenagers who were late. And then, as the hours stretched further, they began to hope for the explanation that would hurt the least. Maybe they had eloped. Maybe they had run off together the way young people sometimes did when they were in love and impatient and believed the future could not wait. It would be a difficult conversation when they came home, but at least they would come home. They did not come home. January 3rd, 1956. Sun River, northwest of Great Falls. On the morning of January 3rd, 3 boys out hiking along the Sun River near Wadsworth Park made a discovery that none of them would ever forget for the rest of their lives. They found a car parked on the road. The engine was still running. The ignition switch, the radio, and the headlights were all on. The car was still in gear, as if it had been abandoned in a moment of sudden violence with no time for anything to be turned off. And lying face down on the ground beside, it was the body of 18-year-old Lloyd Dwayne Bogle. His hands were tied behind his back with his own belt. He had been shot twice in the back of the head. His expensive camera sat untouched on the seat inside the car. Nothing had been stolen. This was not a robbery. The boys alerted the police immediately. Investigators arrived at the scene and confirmed what the evidence already made impossible to deny. Dwayne Bogle was dead, and Patricia Kalitsky was nowhere to be found. The fear that moved through Great Falls in the hours that followed was the fear of the unknown, the specific, suffocating fear of a community that understood someone among them had done something violent and unspeakable and had taken a 16-year-old girl somewhere. Police launched an immediate search across Cascade County. Local newspapers ran urgent headlines. The words "Lover's Lane slaying victims" and "Wide search for a brutal killer" appeared in the Great Falls Tribune in heavy black print. The community held its breath. January 4th, 1956. Vineyard Road, north of Great Falls. The following day, a county road worker driving along Vineyard Road north of the city looked down a 20-foot embankment and saw something at the bottom that made him stop his vehicle. It was Patricia Kalitsky. She had been shot in the head. She had injuries consistent with a violent struggle and a sexual assault. She had been carried miles from where Dwayne had been killed and left at the bottom of an embankment on a gravel road near what locals called Hill 57, in an area where Kenneth Gould was known to ride horses. She was still 16 years old. She still had school in the morning. The community of Great Falls was shattered in the way that small cities are shattered by violent crimes, not just with grief, but with the slow, cold realization that someone had reached into the familiar world they thought they understood and destroyed 2 of their own. 2 teenagers. A lover's lane. A killer who had walked among them, done what he had done, and left no trace. The investigation that followed was the kind that defines a sheriff's office for generations. The Cascade County Sheriff's Office launched an immediate and comprehensive probe. Every man with a questionable history in the area was identified and investigated. Every driver known to have frequented the Lover's Lane area was questioned. Every tip from the community was followed to its end. One of the earliest names that appeared in the investigation was James Joseph Whitey Bulger Jr., the notorious South Boston gangster who had been living in Great Falls in the early 1950s and had actually been arrested for rape in the city in 1951, 5 years before the Kalitsky-Bogle murders. The connection was significant enough to investigate seriously. Bulger was eventually ruled out. In the years and decades that followed, investigators identified and cleared approximately 35 potential suspects in total. Each name was a door that opened, was walked through carefully, and then closed. Another dead end added to a growing file. There was no fingerprint evidence strong enough to identify a killer. There was no witness who had seen the right person at the right time. There was no physical evidence at the scene that pointed to a specific name. The car with the running engine and the tied hands and the untouched camera told investigators what kind of crime this was, but not who had committed it. The case went cold. In 1989, investigators returned to the scene where Bogle's body had been found and removed bullets from a cottonwood tree near the location, hoping new forensic analysis could reveal something the original investigation had missed. The bullets were documented. Nothing conclusive emerged. The file was handed from investigator to investigator. Each one received it, reviewed the years of accumulated documentation, followed whatever new leads presented themselves, and eventually passed it on. The people of Great Falls grew up, had children, had grandchildren. The Lovers' Lane near Wadsworth Park became a public park where families picnicked on summer afternoons. But inside the Cascade County Sheriff's Office, the file of Patricia Kalitsky and Lloyd Dwayne Bogle remained open. Then in the year 2001, more than 45 years after the night of January 2nd, a detective named Phil Madison made a quiet decision that would change everything, even though he would never live to see what it changed. Madison pulled from the evidence archives a microscope slide that had been sitting in storage since 1956. It was a vaginal swab collected from Patricia Kalitsky's body during the autopsy the day she was found. Preserved carefully for 45 years, according to standard forensic protocol. Madison sent it to the Montana State Crime Lab for analysis using the DNA technology that had by 2001 become a standard investigative tool in American law enforcement. The lab examined the slide, and they found something that instantly and permanently changed the direction of the investigation. A single sperm cell, and that single sperm cell did not belong to Lloyd Dwayne Bogle. Someone else had been with Patricia Kalitsky that night, and that person had left behind the only piece of biological evidence in the entire case, preserved by the careful work of the 1956 investigators who had followed proper forensic protocol without knowing they were preserving the answer to a question that would not be asked for another 45 years. The DNA technology of 2001 could confirm the sperm cell existed and did not belong to Bogle, but could not yet reach into the public genealogy databases that did not yet exist and find a name. The sample was documented, packaged, and preserved, and the investigation continued. When Phil Madison retired, he said something honest and heavy. A lot of different people had a turn at this, and we just weren't able to take it to conclusion. He did not believe the case would be solved in his lifetime. He was right about one of those things. In 2012, Detective Sergeant John Cadner of the Cascade County Sheriff's Office was assigned the Kalitsky-Bogle case for the first time. He was 40 years old. He had grown up in small-town Iowa, born more than 2 decades after the night of January 2nd, 1956. The names Patricia Kalitsky and Lloyd Dwayne Bogle meant nothing to him personally until the day he opened that file and began to read. What he found was years and years of documentation. Reports from investigators stretching across half a century. Notes on 35 cleared suspects. Forensic reports from multiple decades. A case that had been touched by many hands and never answered by any of them. Cadner read through it all carefully, and he said something that would later prove to be exactly right. There was just years and years of documentation and numerous suspects that had been looked into. But I knew the key was going to be DNA. He worked the file. He followed new leads where they appeared. He continued what his predecessors had started. And he waited for the technology that he believed would eventually make the difference. In April 2018, that technology announced itself to the entire country in the most dramatic way possible. Joseph James DeAngelo Jr., the Golden State Killer, responsible for at least 13 murders and more than 50 sexual assaults across California throughout the 1970s and 1980s, was arrested after more than 40 years on the run. The tool that identified him was called genetic genealogy, a technique that did not search for the suspect's DNA directly in criminal databases, which only contained DNA from people who have already been convicted. Instead, it uploaded the crime scene DNA to public genealogy databases where millions of ordinary Americans had voluntarily submitted their own genetic information to find relatives and research their ancestry. From those partial matches, investigators built family trees, working backward through generations, narrowing down branch by branch until one name remained that fit every criterion. Cadner followed the Golden State Killer case and thought immediately of the microscope slide in the Cascade County Evidence Archives. A single sperm cell, a DNA profile that had produced no matches in Cody's because the killer had no criminal record. A case that had waited 63 years for exactly this kind of technology to exist. In 2019, Cadner contacted Bode Technology, a Virginia-based forensic DNA laboratory that specialized in exactly this kind of advanced analysis. He arranged for them to perform additional testing on the evidence collected from Patricia Kolitsky's body in 1956. The sample, that single sperm cell preserved on a microscope slide for 63 years, was sent to the lab. Bode Technology ran the analysis and uploaded the resulting DNA profile to voluntary genealogy databases, the same platforms where ordinary Americans had submitted their own DNA to find distant cousins and trace immigrant ancestors, never imagining their genetic information might one day help solve a murder from before they were born. The results came back. 3 people in the database were genetically compatible with the DNA from the crime scene. Among those 3 was a connection to a family name that had never appeared in 65 years of investigation, across 35 cleared suspects, across decades of dead ends. The name was Gould. Kenneth Gould was a Great Falls native. On the night of January 2nd, 1956, he was 29 years old. He was a horse trainer. He lived approximately 1 mile from Patricia Kolitsky's family home on the southwest side of Great Falls. He worked corralling horses just blocks from where she lived. He was known to ride horses through the area of Vineyard Road, the exact road where Patricia's body had been found at the bottom of a 20-foot embankment. He had no criminal record. He had no police file. Nothing in his history had ever given any investigator across 65 years of investigation a reason to look in his direction. He was simply a local man, a familiar face in the neighborhood, someone whose presence on the streets of Great Falls in January 1956 raised no questions from anyone. After the murders, his behavior told a story that only became readable 65 years later. Just over 1 month after the killings, Kenneth Gould sold the family property and moved his family away from Great Falls. First to Tracy, a small community southeast of the city, then to Geraldine, then to Hamilton, and eventually in 1967, out of Montana entirely, moving to Missouri and never returning to the state where he had grown up, the state where he had killed 2 teenagers on a winter night and left one face down beside his car and the other at the bottom of an embankment 5 miles away. One more detail that Cadner found significant when he pieced the picture together. When Kenneth Gould was 25 years old, he had married a 16-year-old girl, the same age as Patricia Kolitsky when he murdered her. Gould had died on May 31, 2007, in Oregon County, Missouri, at the age of 79. He had lived 51 years after the night of January 2, 1956. 51 years of freedom, of raising a family, of moving from town to town across Montana and eventually out of the state, of watching the world change around him, of seeing new technologies emerge, of living long enough to see the internet age arrive, never knowing that somewhere in a sheriff's office in the city he had fled, a microscope slide was waiting for the technology that would eventually speak his name. His body had been cremated after his death. There was no body to exhume for a direct DNA comparison. The only path to confirmation was through his surviving children. Cadner reached out to them. He explained what he had found and what he needed. He was not certain how they would respond. I wasn't sure how they were going to react when I come to them saying, "Hey, your dad is suspect in this case," Cadner said later. But they were great to work with. Gould's children consented to provide DNA samples. The results came back. The DNA from Kenneth Gould's children confirmed the match. The single sperm cell preserved on a microscope slide since 1956, through 45 years in evidence storage before anyone could read what it contained, through another 18 years of waiting for the right technology, pointed with certainty to Kenneth Gould as the man who had murdered Lloyd Dwayne Bogle and raped and murdered Patricia Kolitsky on the night of January 2nd, 1956. June 8th, 2021. Great Falls, Montana. On June 8th, 2021, Detective Sergeant John Cadner of the Cascade County Sheriff's Office stood before the press in Great Falls and announced that the 65-year-old case of Patricia Kolitsky and Lloyd Dwayne Bogle had been solved. The killer was Kenneth Gould, a Great Falls native, a horse trainer, a neighbor, a man who had lived 1 mile from Patricia's home, ridden horses along the same roads where her body was found, attended the same city as her family for years after the murders, and then quietly packed up and left 6 weeks after killing her, spending the next 5 decades of his life in freedom before dying in Missouri in 2007, 14 years before his name was ever connected to what he had done. The case was closed with the determination that Gould was the likely suspect. Because he was deceased and had been cremated, there would be no arrest, no handcuffs, no courtroom, no moment where a jury read a verdict aloud and the families of Patricia Kalitsky and Lloyd Dwayne Bogle could sit and watch. There was only a name, a press conference, and newspaper clippings from 1956 displayed on a table in the sheriff's office press room, next to photographs of 2 teenagers who had driven west out of Great Falls on a January evening and never come back. Cadner said he believed it was the oldest homicide case in the United States ever solved using genetic genealogy. The evidence that made it possible was a single biological sample, preserved on a microscope slide through more than 6 decades in the archives of the county sheriff's office in Montana, by investigators who had followed the right procedures in 1956 without knowing they were preserving the answer to a question that would take until 2021 to ask correctly. Dwayne Bogle's family had carried the weight of that January night for most of their lives. A woman who knew Dwayne's brother told Cadner that he had been a successful man in many ways, but that the unresolved question of what happened to Dwayne and Patricia had never fully left him through all of it. Now there was an answer, not a trial, not a sentence, not a moment of confrontation, but a name and the certainty that the name was right. For Patricia Kalitsky, who had school in the morning on January 3rd, 1956, and never made it there. And for Lloyd Dwayne Bogle, the young airman from Waco, Texas, who was instantly smitten with a girl from Montana and was carrying a camera because he believed the future was something worth capturing. Their story finally had an ending. Not the one they deserved, but an ending. The Patricia Kalitsky and Lloyd Dwayne Bogle case leaves behind lessons that every American, especially young people and the families who love them, can carry into their daily lives today. First, always tell someone exactly where you're going and when you expect to return, not in general terms, but specifically the road, the location, the time. In 1956, Patricia's family knew only that she had gone out with Dwayne. No one knew they were heading to the Lover's Lane along the Sun River. In 2025, with smartphones and real-time location sharing, there is no reason a parent should not know exactly where their child is at any given moment of the night. Second, this case proves that biological evidence collected at a crime scene and preserved correctly will outlast every other investigative method. If your family is waiting for answers in an unsolved violent crime, ask the investigating agency 2 specific questions. Is the biological evidence still preserved? And has it been submitted for forensic genetic genealogy analysis through companies like Bode Technology or Parabon Nanolabs? Cody's requires the suspect to already be in the system. Genetic genealogy can find a suspect through their relatives, even if that suspect died decades ago. Third, the killer in this case had no criminal record before January 2nd, 1956. Nothing in his behavior before that night would have identified him as dangerous to any neighbor or investigator. He was a familiar face on familiar streets. Danger does not always carry a warning. And finally, this case is proof that a single cell, properly preserved, carries the truth across any length of time. 65 years. Through the lifetimes of multiple investigators, through decades of failed leads and closed doors, through the entire life and death of the man who left it behind. That one cell waited, and when the right moment arrived, it spoke clearly enough to close a case that had been open since Eisenhower was president. If this story moved you, please subscribe so you don't miss the next cases. Each video is a real family, a real name, and sometimes a truth that waited longer than a lifetime to finally be told. Thank you for watching until the very end. See you in the next case.